My name is Michael Ketchum, and I'm going to be covering slice data validation and quality control that we do here in the emissions inventory section. So I want to start by looking at some of the data validation that the slice application does as you are entering your data and submitting your emissions inventory. Slice has data validation built into the application. This happens in two places. It will happen on individual pages as you enter and save information. And then it also happens during a final validation before you submit the report. Generally speaking, there should be fewer validation issues within the application with the 2020 reports compared to the 2019 reports for those of you that reported last year. However, if you didn't report in 2019, for example, PBRs, then you likely will have a few more validation issues to work through as it will be your first time to do a slice submission. So we're going to walk through the different validation errors and messages that you'll see in the application, and we're going to start with release points. Before we get into this first one, I want to point out that the title for these slides, in this case, the release point, stack diameter, flow rate, and or velocity are invalid. This is the actual error message or validation message that you will see in Slice. The way you can break these down, the first bit will tell you where in the application the issue occurs. So in this case, it's happening on the release point. And then the rest of it is the actual issue that you're running into. In this case, our stack diameter, flow rate, and or velocity are invalid. So on this particular validation issue, Slice is calculating the flow rate or the velocity based on the information that you have entered. If you're entering these from scratch for the first time, Slice will auto-calculate as you fill these in. You can overwrite them, but they do have to pass validation. This is the formula that Slice is using to calculate, in this case, the exit gas velocity. So you can kind of check your work against that. One important thing to remember here is that you must be using the correct units. For both the flow rate and the velocity, you have a couple different options. So make sure you've chosen the correct one to match the information that you entered. If you are fixing a flow rate or velocity that has already been entered, one thing you can do is if you delete the fields, clear them out, and re-enter the information, that's a way you can get Slice to re-auto calculate for you as well, if it's not one that you're creating from scratch. So that's a handy little trick you can use. All right, the next one, again, this is a validation issue that occurs at the release point. So the issue here is that the exit gas flow rate or exit gas velocity is required. So in this case, it's saying that you can't report a 0 for the flow rate or the exit gas velocity. In Slice, if you only report one of these, Slice will autofill the other. Additionally, you can type both of them in Redbud, which was our previous reporting system. You could get away with it was only required that you reported one of those. Slice actually isn't going to let you just do one. It's going to, if you only do the exit gas flow rate, it's going to auto calculate the velocity. Same thing, if you only enter the velocity, it's going to auto calculate the flow rate. So make sure you check those. All right, moving on to control devices. Again, now these will be validation issues that occur on the control device page. This first one, the issue is that the pollutant reduction efficiency must be greater than 5% and less than 99.99%. In the past, control devices were often reported incorrectly. They had either incorrect or missing efficiency. We didn't really have a way for those to be checked as information was entered. So now with Slice, the reduction efficiency has to be within this range, greater than or equal to 5%, less than or equal to 99%. Pollutants can be removed from a control device, or they could be moved to a different control device if they shouldn't be associated with that device. In the past, it was often a carryover if a pollutant was no longer should no longer be controlled with that control device. The efficiency would be removed. Now you can actually just move or delete that pollutant. Another control device validation message you'll likely see that the pollutant reduction efficiency is required. In Redbud, in our previous system, if the factor included the control efficiency, then you didn't have to report that. We didn't require that. Slice, we have a change here. An efficiency must always be reported. It's no longer acceptable to not report that. And in fact, you can't save your control information on the control page without having that efficiency reported. It won't let you move forward. All right, moving on to the unit processes. For unit processes where the control device efficiency must not exceed 100% within a given sequence. So this issue is found on the unit process page, as you can see there in the first part of our validation message there in the title, but it is dealing with control devices because control devices are tagged at the unit process, and that's also where you can put them in sequence. So that's a new thing in Slice. For those of you who didn't report in 2019, you can have multiple control devices set in a sequence. This particular issue occurs when the control devices are in the same sequence and their efficiencies add to greater than 100%. Right, so here on this next slide, we've got an example of this. So let me kind of walk you through here. On the on the left-hand side, you can see we have 4 control devices. They are each in their own sequence. We've got sequence 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it is appropriate for each of those to have a 100% capture efficiency. On the right, this is where we have that error message popping up. You can see we have 2 control devices in sequence 1, and they both have a capture efficiency of 100%. That's not appropriate. If those were equally split, those would each be 50%, or maybe a 60-40, whatever is actually happening at your facility. But they have to add to 100% or less. All right, moving on to process emissions. So this is the point at which, up to this point, most of these validation issues are things that once you have fixed them the first time, you're probably not going to run into them again because control, release point, process information, that's all carried from year to year. Process emissions, though, that's the stuff that you enter new each year. So you are a little more likely to run into these on a year-to-year basis. All right, so this first one occurs on the process emissions page. And this issue is that the operation's actual hours must be within 90 to 110% of the calculated total. So Slice is validating that the average days per week, hours per day, and weeks per year calculate to match the reported actual hours per year. Slice will, as you enter these, Slice will autofill the actual hours per year based on the inputs. If you watched Grant's video already on the calculations, you saw him do this. You can overwrite what Slice autofills, but it has to pass this 90 to 110% of calculated total validation. So as long as you're entering this new each time, you should be pretty close. So just pay attention to those. You're actually not able to save the process emissions information until this validation issue is satisfied. So you can't move on from this step. This is one of those you have to do kind of in real time as you enter the information. If your process had no hours, if it didn't operate at all, or if the emissions were below the reporting threshold, what you can do to signify that is on the first tab on the process emissions page, you can uncheck the process as reported box on that process tab, and that will indicate that you had no hours and no emissions and no throughput. Here's where that box is. You can see there, when you uncheck that box, it will require you to add a note at the bottom of the page to explain why this process is not reported. All right, now we're going to move on to the quality control that we do in-house in the emissions inventory section after you have submitted your inventory. These are the things that you might hear from us after the reporting season, asking some questions, or maybe we have some things for you to fix based on your submission and based on the QC that we do in-house. So the first one I want to talk about is control devices, because this was a big one for the 2019 reports, and we will likely still have some of these that need to be cleaned up for those of you that are reporting for the first time in 2020. Controls are very different in SLICE compared to Redbud, our previous reporting system. So really make sure that you pay extra attention to how control devices in your calculations interact. Grant showed you in his calculations video a couple of the different ways that the control devices affect the calculations. So just make sure you're paying attention to those. For the 2019 reports, we saw a lot of instances where a pollutant was reported with a no control calculation method, but then it was tagged as controlled at the related control device. So that's saying two different things there. It can't be not controlled on the calculation method, but then still controlled by the control device. So if your pollutant actually is controlled, make sure you use a pre or post control emission factor. If it's not controlled, and the no control calculation method is correct, make sure you remove that pollutant from the control device. The next issue that we look for is if we see a significant change in emissions from the previous reporting year. Often we see that emissions at an emission unit increase or decrease significantly without any significant change in the throughput or the operating time. Excess emissions can be an explanation for that. Definitely report those in your emissions inventory. But we'll often email companies to verify that emissions are accurate and ask for an explanation in this change, because we often encounter typos with this check. So if you do have a situation where your emissions did significantly change for some reason, it really helps if you provide a detailed note for us. Then we can validate that without needing to contact you. We also want to talk about the DEQ approved calculation method. This is another one that we check in our quality control checks. The DEQ approved calculation method should only be selected if no other calculation method is available. If you do use the DEQ approved method, please make sure that you add a comment indicating why you've chosen to use that method, so that we can validate those and make sure that it's an appropriate use of that calculation method. And remember, you do need to get DEQ approval before you select the DEQ approved method. All right, now we're going to move on and talk about HAPs and Total VOC. This is one of the big issues that we run into each year, and one of the main things we have to ask companies to fix. So just as a refresher, or maybe if this is your first time to hear this, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, are organic compounds that contain carbon and react in the presence of sunlight with NOx to form ozone. Hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, are compounds that have been included on EPA's list of, there's 187 pollutants that have a detrimental effect on humans and the environment. So many HAPs are also VOCs. Both HAPs and total VOC must be reported, but just to put your mind at ease, you are not double billed. We split these out when we do your annual invoices. Here's a visual representation of what this looks like and what it means for your emissions inventory. Basically, your total VOC amount should be greater than or equal to the total of the individual HAPs. So an easy way for you to check this is just make sure that before you do your submission, that your total VOC amount is greater than or equal to all of your individual HAPs. That's a big one that we run into. We also want to talk here about inconsistent statuses, really across all types of equipment and objects in SLICE. This was another big one that we ran into with the 2019 reports. Slice doesn't look at statuses across all related pieces of equipment, so that's up to you, the user, to make sure that you're keeping track of and appropriately changing statuses. On an emission unit, if your emission unit is operating, the annual process rate and annual operating hours can't be 0. It's required if you're reporting emissions. As we mentioned earlier, if your emission unit is operating, but your emissions are below the reporting threshold, then you can use that process as reported box. You can uncheck that to say that you don't have any emissions to report there. If the equipment ran more than 0 hours at any point in the year, its status on the emission unit page must be operating. Again, Slice is not going to validate inconsistent statuses across the pages, so you have to really pay attention to these. For example, if you change a release point to temporarily shut down, then you also need to go set emission units and control devices to temporarily shut down as well, and go check your process to make sure that's appropriately set too. Along with the operation status, Slice has some dates to indicate when those statuses are changed and when they're valid. So there is both a status date and a last and final emissions year. These text fields, this is actually copied out of the help text that you see in Slice. So I'm not going to read through these because they're in the application, but I'm going to explain them a little bit here on this next slide. The status date is found on release points, control devices, and emission units. It's required if you are changing status to temporarily or permanently shut down. You do have to put a status date in. It is not needed if you are reporting a piece of equipment as operating. One thing to keep in mind, though, if you have, let's say, a emission unit that is temporarily shut down, and it was given a status date of January 1, 2019, and you're changing it back to operating for 2020, you would need to go ahead and update that status. It won't automatically do that. You have to manually change that status date. Temporarily or permanently shut down can only be used if the equipment was shut down for the entire year. So as an example here, let's say your emission unit shut down September 18, 2020. You would report it as operating for 2020. You would then report it as permanently shut down in 2021, and you would give it a permanently shut down status date of January 1, 2021. This is to keep from having any kind of partial year emissions. We don't track that in Slice. We do things as an entire annual year. So status dates should always be January 1 of the appropriate year. The last and final emissions year is found on the process page. This should only be used when the process will never be reported again. So here in our same example, if your emission unit permanently shut down on September 18 of 2020, then its last or final emissions year is 2020. That's saying that there will not be any emissions from this process after 2020. And in the last and final emissions year, it's just a year. You don't have a month or date associated with that. All right, moving on to another check that we do. We look for instances where companies report the same throughput, annual hours, and emissions as the previous year when they're exactly the same from year to year. For most emission units, the throughput, annual hours, and emissions should vary from year to year. They might be similar, but it's highly unlikely that they are exactly the same. That typically shows that maybe companies are just reporting an estimate and not the actual emissions, where it's required that the actual emissions are reported. There are a few instances, things like emergency engines, that are tested on a regular schedule where it might be valid to have the same values. But generally speaking, for the most part, we should see at least a minor change from year to year. If we do run across these, this is one of those that we'll reach out to you and ask, hey, what's going on here? I also want to touch on produced water tank emissions because we get these a lot. And sometimes this is one of those things that needs to be corrected kind of during our QC window. Permits do not always reference the produced water tanks, but if the VOC emissions are greater than 0.1 tons for the year, then the produced water emissions do need to be reported. To calculate your produced water emissions, you can enter the volume of produced water into the DEQ storage tank emissions calculation tool as if it were condensate or crude oil. Run that tool and then take 1% of the resulting value and use that as your produced water emissions. New and existing equipment. This one gets a little more tricky in Slice because of your ability to change some of the information about equipment. Your inventory should be an accurate reflection of the equipment at your facility. So it's really important in Slice that you are adding new equipment when appropriate. If you add a piece of equipment at your facility, that should be created from scratch in Slice. Do not convert an existing emission unit to a new piece of equipment. If you say swapped out an engine, then the old engine, that emission unit should be shut down and you should create a new one, a new emission unit for the new engine. We track equipment historically with unique identifiers, so that can really cause some problems if you're not if you try to convert an existing piece of equipment rather than creating a new one. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you're doing your emissions inventory. All right, the last thing I want to touch on is amendments. If we find something in our internal QC, we might ask you to do an amendment. You might come across things on your own that you realize, hey, we did this wrong and we need to correct and do an amendment for one of our reports. We're going to talk real quickly about how that is going to be done in Slice. So amendments are now done within the Slice application. You can actually request to do an amendment at any time during the year for any report that is in the Slice application. When you're doing an amendment, your Slice role does still apply. Both editors and submitters can request an amendment, but then only the submitter can actually submit that amendment to us. Another change from last year is that DEQ staff can now initiate amendments for critical issues. If we were to do that, it would be an issue where we've been in touch with you about, hey, we found this, it needs to be fixed. So that would not come as a surprise to anybody. To actually request your amendment, if you go to the report year page, the main landing page for, say, a 2019 report, on the right-hand side, on the blue menu, there's a request amendment button. If you click on that, it will take you to a page with a text box, and it will ask you to give a reason for your amendment, why you're requesting that. We ask you to indicate if you are adding previously unreported equipment or if your amendment request is coming from an enforcement case or from an inspector. This is so that if it's from an enforcement case, we can keep that inspector updated once that amendment has been taken care of. And then also, like we mentioned earlier, there are some steps we'll have to take if you're adding new equipment to an old report. Some steps we'll have to take to ensure that the unique identifiers are being tracked correctly from year to year. So we'll have to help you with that. If your amendment request is granted, you will receive an email indicating that, and then you can make any of your needed changes and resubmit your report. Here's where you can find that request amendment button. You can see it's highlighted in that blue box over there on the right-hand side. All right, so last thing I want to touch on just real quick is why your inventory is important and why we spend so much time making sure that Slice is correctly validating your data and why we spend so much time doing in-house QC on your data after it's been submitted. So missing or incorrect release point data leads to errors in geographic location of emissions, and that can impact our modeling and health risk assessments. Missing and incorrect hours and seasonal percentages can affect how we look at the temporal distribution of emissions. If there are errors in SCCs or SICs, that can impact our control strategy development and impact our attainment plans. And then just general missing or incorrect control equipment data can impact our rule development and how we look at developing those. So generally, just good data leads to effective air quality regulation. So we want to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information that we can. And then finally, if you ever have any questions about QC, or if you have questions about the validation errors that you might be seeing in SLICE, you can always feel free to contact us. You can either email us at aei@deq.ok.gov or give us a call, and the receptionist will point you to the right direction to get your question answered.